Good morning and welcome to today's Upskill workshop. My name is Sharda Kalanidhi, Technical Director of the WIDS Datathon. I've had the privilege of being involved with the Datathon, particularly the dataset preparation piece, for many years now, and today I will be your workshop host. Today's Upskill workshop will be presented by Leticia Nogueira, Scientific Director at American Cancer Society. Leticia, she's the scientific director of health services research at the Surveillance and Health Equity Sciences Department at the American Cancer Society. Dr. Nogueira's research focuses on cancer disparities that can be addressed through policy changes, especially those related to climate change and structural racism. She also holds an adjunct professor position at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. Dr. Nogueira earned her PhD in molecular biology from the University of Texas at Austin and her MPH in quantitative methods from the Harvard School of Public Health. Today, Leticia will deliver the workshop, Climate Change and Cancer. After her workshop, we'll have a brief fireside chat and take questions from the audience. If you have questions for Leticia, please enter them in the Q&A section of the webinar. Over to you, Leticia.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Very much appreciated. All right, let me see. Let me know when you can see the slides and we'll jump right into it. Can you see the slides? Yeah? Okay, great. So my name is Leticia Nogueira. I am a researcher at the American Cancer Society, and today I'll tell you a little bit about the connection between climate change and cancer. So Hurricane Harvey was when climate change and cancer collided for me. I was working at the Texas State Health Department at the time, and I was able to see firsthand the impact that climate-driven disasters can have on communities. Let me explain. Climate change alters the behavior of extreme weather events. Warmer air holds more water vapor, which increases the water capacity of hurricanes. And we could see this with Harvey. Here is a map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, showing rainfall over Houston during Harvey. And NOAA had to add new colors to the legend because it had never rained so much in one spot before. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't the first time that Houston had been impacted by a hurricane. The hospitals thought they were prepared. They all had backup generators, but Harvey was different. It stalled over Houston. Then it rained. Then it flooded. Then the backup generators flooded. Extreme weather events can damage medical infrastructure, break transportation links, disrupt supply chains, and interrupt access to medical care. And the changing frequency and behavior of extreme weather events is making it harder for communities to prepare and respond to increasingly unpredictable circumstances, which is especially concerning for medically vulnerable populations who rely on uninterrupted access to care. Soon after working on the response to Harvey, I joined the American Cancer Society, and the very first project I proposed was to evaluate the impact of hurricanes on cancer patients. And when I said that, people started laughing. Did she just say hurricanes and cancer? I'm telling you this because I don't want you to be discouraged from leaning on your lived experiences when proposing efforts on this topic. As more and more of us are personally exposed to climate-driven disasters, the expertise that we gain from these lived experiences is exactly the type of knowledge that we need to tackle such a rapidly evolving crisis. It took some convincing, but in the end, we did run the study that used the National Cancer Database, a hospital-based cancer registry co-sponsored by the American Cancer Society and the American College of Surgeons. For this project, we chose to focus on radiation therapy because it's highly dependent on electricity, which is frequently disrupted by hurricanes. It requires the presence of specialized teams, which is also made difficult by hurricanes, and it must be given daily, so the patients have to have access to the facility. Because NCDB collects treatment information, including the dates when radiation therapy started and ended, and the location of the treating facility, we were able to use FEMA data, which has information about presidential disaster declarations, to identify patients whose facility was impacted by a hurricane, and propensity score matched them with similar patients who were unexposed. And in the end, we found that lung cancer patients whose facility was impacted by a hurricane during their radiation treatment had worse overall survival than similar patients who were treated at the same facility, but at a time when no disasters happened, showing how climate-driven disasters can disrupt access to potentially life-saving care. Now, one question I frequently get while presenting the results of the hurricane study is, well, yeah, but how many patients or how many facilities are really at risk of being impacted by a hurricane? Well, this map is showing the healthcare facilities that were impacted by a hurricane severe enough to become a presidential disaster declaration between 2016 and 2020. These are, of course, highly populated areas in the United States, with some of the largest cancer centers in the country, so many patients would be impacted. We estimated that 63% of facilities in the United States were impacted by a hurricane in those 5 years. And of course, hurricanes are just one type of extreme weather event. If we include other types, the number changes. 99% of healthcare facilities in the US were impacted by an extreme weather event in those 5 years. So what can we do? Enhancing emergency preparedness plan is one obvious way that we can contribute. We recently evaluated what type of emergency preparedness information is available in NCI designated cancer centers websites, because these are distributed nationwide, are known for high quality cancer care and research, and they're a trusted source of information in their communities. First, we checked, and yes, every single NCI designated cancer center has been recently impacted by a climate-driven extreme weather event that was severe enough to become a FEMA presidential disaster declaration. Then, although we set out to evaluate climate-relevant emergency preparedness information, we immediately noticed that most websites provided some type of information about the COVID-19 pandemic, which was declared a national disaster in March of 2020, demonstrating that these centers were able to quickly act on issues that are prioritized. Fewer cancer centers websites provided information on climate-driven disasters, which have been impacting healthcare facilities since before of March 2020, as we just saw. The majority of centers that provided any information had information in steps that the individuals can take for COVID and for climate that included preparing a portable medical card or pre-registering for special needs shelters. But I would argue that putting the burden on the patient to prepare for an emergency might not be the best strategy. To be fair, some websites also provided information on steps that the institutions were taking for COVID and for climate that included consolidating appointments to minimize the time that the patients spend outdoors when there's a wildfire. Now, CMS, who pays a lot of these hospitals, already requires that all participating institutions, which include all NCI designated cancer centers, have an emergency preparedness plan. However, CMS does not require that these institutions share these plans with CMS or with each other. And this is where we could really make a difference, because with climate change, these disruptions in access to care will only become more common. Information sharing would allow healthcare facilities throughout the US to continuously improve their response to disasters. And cancer centers are well positioned to lead research on climate adaptation, because cancer is not one disease, it's many different diseases, each with comorbidities and treatment side effects that can then inform how to tend to the specific needs of many different medically vulnerable populations. But disruptions in access to care was not the only health consequence of climate-driven disasters that I witnessed while I was working on the response to Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane Harvey's unprecedented precipitation, which climate change made 3.5 times more likely to happen, flooded chemical plants, oil refineries, and Superfund sites that released a lot of carcinogens into the Houston community. And because I was familiar with cancer clusters in this area, another connection between climate change and cancer became obvious to me. And that's that our reliance on fossil fuels is a shared cause of climate change and an increasing exposure to carcinogens. Once you recognize this connection, one of the first examples that might come to mind is lung cancer and air pollution from vehicle emissions. The same air pollution that is driving the greenhouse effect also increases lung cancer risk. However, extracting, processing, transporting, and waste management of fossil fuels all release carcinogens in our communities before and after they are consumed. Take fracking, which is used to extract natural gas, for example. In addition to the methane that is released at the wells, the compressor stations release fine particulate matter, benzene, formaldehyde, and other non-human carcinogens. Then there is the waste that flows back up a fracked well, which also contains carcinogens and is transported by diesel trucks into injection wells, where they can then contaminate water sources. Flaring, another common practice in both fossil fuel extraction and processing, can impact air quality, which fuels climate change and worsening exposure to air pollution in nearby communities. Because processing is the next step on the fossil fuel pathway. I mentioned that Hurricane Harvey flooded several Superfund sites in Houston. I'm not sure everybody here knows what Superfund sites are. This name, Superfund, comes from legislation Congress passed in 1980 that allowed government funds to be used to clean up these highly contaminated sites. As you can imagine, whenever government funds are involved, it takes a lot to be considered a Superfund site. This is an example of the process from the EPA website. And a quick search of existing Superfund sites will help you understand just how much oil refineries contribute to an increasing exposure to carcinogens. Every other Superfund site used to be an oil refinery. Of course, oil refineries in operation today still release carcinogens in communities, as we saw in Houston and also with the Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Another example of how our reliance on fossil fuels increases risk of exposure to carcinogens is during transportation. I think we all saw the Ohio train derailment in the news. The train was carrying vinyl chloride, a petrochemical used in plastic production that is also an established Group 1 carcinogen. We don't have time today to go and talk about the dirty details of each step of the fossil fuel infrastructure, but I believe you've seen enough to understand that each component releases greenhouse gases, which are contributing to climate change, but also release carcinogens in the communities that are surrounding, hindering our cancer prevention efforts. And because climate change alters the frequency and behavior of extreme weather events, making it harder for communities to prepare and respond to increasingly unpredictable circumstances. When disaster strikes, communities can be exposed to even higher levels of these carcinogens, such as what happened in Houston during Harvey. And these climate-driven disasters can also result in disruptions in access to care. So climate change impacts every single step of the cancer control continuum, including survivorship, because individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer are a vulnerable population to the health hazards of climate change due to the physical, psychological, and socioeconomic consequences of cancer diagnosis and treatment. The physical and psychological consequences listed here, for example, lead to increased sensitivity to the health hazards of climate change. Some cancer treatment drugs can inhibit thermoregulation, making cancer patients more vulnerable to heat waves. A weakened immune system can make people more vulnerable to infections, which are common during flooding events. Cancer diagnosis and treatment also has socioeconomic consequences due to out-of-pocket expenses and changes in the ability to remain employed. And these socioeconomic consequences can impact the adaptive capacity by making it harder for us to prepare and respond to disasters. Financial hardship impacts our ability to evacuate, stockpile food, adapt our housing infrastructure to cope with extreme weather events, such as using air conditioning during a heat wave, which costs money, or installing special air filters during wildfires. And wildfire activity, which is closely tied to temperature and drought, is increasing in the United States no matter how you measure it. This, combined with the growth of the wildland-urban interface, which is the area where houses and wildland vegetation commingle, this leads to an increasing exposure to wildfires. And if you're picturing California in your head, and I know many of you are, I want you to take a look at this map showing the distribution of the wildland-urban interface in orange in the United States. It is not concentrated in Western states. We recently used NASA satellite data to evaluate the association between proximity to wildfires and survival among lung cancer patients. We chose to use NASA satellite data instead of on-the-ground air quality monitors because proximity to wildfire goes beyond exposure to pollution and includes the stress associated with potentially having to evacuate, water and soil contamination, threat to property and life, and these are present no matter which way the smoke plume is blowing. And here again, we used NCDB data and found that individuals who were exposed to a wildfire within 6 months of discharge from the hospital following lung cancer surgery had worse overall survival than unexposed individuals, showing how cancer patients are a vulnerable population to the threats of climate change. The NASA Earth Observatory Initiative is encouraging researchers to use satellite data to measure exposure to extreme weather events on Earth. The repertoire goes way beyond wildfires and includes air quality, temperature, even dust storms. This is an especially valuable resource for research on climate change and health, specifically HACAS, the NASA Health and Air Quality Applied Science teams, has the mission to partner with health researchers so NASA satellite data can be used for this exact purpose. I'm a NASA HACAS ambassador, so feel free to contact me if you'd like more information on how to access that data. And one way to think about research projects on climate change and health is to understand there are three factors that determine vulnerability to the health hazards of climate change: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is the human contact with environmental hazards. Sensitivity is the degree to which the climate hazard actually impacts us. And adaptive capacity is our ability to cope with these climate hazards. We just saw a few examples of how a cancer diagnosis can increase our vulnerability to climate hazards by increasing our sensitivity and reducing our adaptive capacity. But people are more than their cancer diagnosis. Due to how our society is structured, different individual characteristics, including the groups we're racialized into, our gender identity, the languages we speak, our socioeconomic status, all can impact our vulnerability to the health hazards of climate change. One of the most widely recognized examples of this within the US is redlining, when racial composition was used as part of assessment of areas that were worthy of receiving federal loans during recovery from the Great Depression. Hoag staff literally drew red lines, hence the term redlining, around communities with large Black populations, flagging them as hazardous investment areas and limiting the options available to these communities. Of course, this strategy of controlling access to resources, especially land, is nothing new, as this map of indigenous land theft in the US shows. And globally, colonialism used violence to create hierarchical racial categorizations to justify slavery and establish the dominance of imperial powers over colonies through extraction, displacement, degradation, and impoverishment. Historical racist practices within the United States included mob violence against Black individuals who moved into white neighborhoods and undervaluing of real estate in Black neighborhoods, a practice that persists to this day. These practices foster racial residential segregation, and racial residential segregation formed a platform for broad disinvestment in these communities, from infrastructure, green spaces, housing stock, roads, services, transportation, schools, garbage collection, and employment opportunities. And as we saw, limited access to resources hinders the adaptive capacity or the ability to cope with environmental hazards. So similar to the socioeconomic challenges faced by individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer, individuals from communities targeted for marginalization also face socioeconomic challenges that make it harder to prepare and respond to disasters. Broad disinvestment in these communities also led to a concentration of psychosocial stressors and created barriers in access to health resources, including increased exposure to alcohol and tobacco outlets and lower access to healthy foods. These barriers led to an increased prevalence of chronic disease burden in these communities. And as we saw, chronic health conditions can make an individual more sensitive to the health threats of climate change. Again, similar to individuals who have been diagnosed with cancer. Due to discriminatory policies and practices, individuals that are residing in historically red line neighborhoods are also more likely to be exposed to environmental hazards. And exposure is, of course, the third component that determines vulnerability. This includes air pollution and even heat the poster child of climate change. I think we are all tired of hearing how temperatures today are the hottest they have ever been. A feeling that actually has a name now, broken record, record breaking. And exposure to extreme heat is one example of the long-lasting consequences of discriminatory policies and practices, because impervious surfaces such as asphalt and concrete trap heat in urban centers, which is known as urban heat islands, and urban heat islands are more common in previously redlined areas. And here we can start to see how racism is a system with compounding consequences. Because if increased exposure wasn't enough, individuals from communities targeted for marginalization are more likely to have their electricity disconnected than individuals racialized as white who received the same shut-off notice, exacerbating disparities in heat-related health hazards by decreasing the adaptive capacity of these communities. Now, even if you have air conditioning and you can afford to turn it on, it does not mean you'll be able to use it during a heat wave. The changing climate is making power failures more common, due in part to an increased demand on the electrical grid as people turn up the AC. These figures showed modeled indoor temperatures during a heat wave with the power on and with the power off, such as during a blackout. I'm showing you this because there's this biased perception that climate change is going to be a problem one day in the future for those people over there. But climate change is already a problem right now for all of us. And while it is true that communities targeted for marginalization suffer first and most from the health threats of climate change, nobody is safe. And it's exactly because communities targeted for marginalization suffer first and most that we need to include these neglected voices in the conversation. A lot of times when you're closer to the problem, you're closer to the solution. For example, fossil fuel infrastructure is usually developed in proximity to communities targeted for marginalization, where systematic exclusion of these individuals from power structures led to political disempowerment, which is also true for hazardous waste sites, a fundamental environmental justice issue. If we understand that our continued reliance on fossil fuels is a shared cause of climate change and an increasing exposure to carcinogens, then we understand why engaging with the expertise of individuals from environmental justice communities is fundamental for research on climate change and cancer. Cancer Alley did not get its nickname because of cancer research. This knowledge of increased risk of cancer associated with the siting of nearly 200 petrochemical facilities in this community came from their lived experiences. And these communities have been identifying not only the health hazards, but also the solutions, such as opposing development of more fossil fuel infrastructure, with opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Formosa plastic plants as recent examples. Now, I know that the Dakota Access Pipeline and even the Formosa plastic plants might feel far away. So let me give you another example closer to home. I think all of us live somewhat close to a highway, and highway construction was another government-sponsored discriminatory practice that fostered racial residential segregation. Also called white men's road through black men's homes, highway construction prioritized transportation of white individuals who had privileged access to property in suburban areas. The highways targeted predominantly black neighborhoods, demolished property, and forced businesses to close, again, limiting access to resources. This is an example in Tampa, Florida, where I live today, which when constructed, targeted predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Unsurprisingly, individuals from communities that were targeted for highway construction and therefore have been closer to the problem are now leading neighborhood reconstruction efforts aimed at removing this type of infrastructure. Again, with implications for climate change, because highways prolong our dependence on fossil fuels, and also to public health, because while it is true that the individuals residing in neighborhoods that were targeted for highway construction are disproportionately exposed to air pollution, you cannot tell air pollution to stay in one place. So highway removal reduces exposure to air pollution in the entire population. Highway removal is not the only example, of course. I'll give you another one. After Hurricane Maria devastated the electric grid in Puerto Rico, island residents have been leading efforts in developing microgrid systems, which improve resilience to power outages because, unlike diesel, microgrids don't need to be transported, so they are more resilient to disruptions in the supply chain. Also, this is what a diesel powered emergency generator looks like when they're not flooded and they're working properly. So, a shift towards clean energy sources generated on site, such as microgrids, also reduces exposure of surrounding communities to toxic air pollution during emergencies. And these strategies are now being adopted in other settings. Building on the experience in Puerto Rico, CMS recently published a categorical waiver allowing healthcare institutions to rely on microgrid systems for emergency powers, reducing reliance on fossil fuels and facilitating the transition to clean energy. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides financial incentives for institutions to transition to environmentally responsible infrastructure, there's a lot of opportunity here. You want another example? I know. Dietary choices are another point where climate change and health outcomes intersect. Environmentally responsible food manufacture, shipment, and waste options are frequently associated with healthier food options. We know that meat from ruminants has the highest environmental impact, no matter how you measure it. If you consider the emissions associated with the production, processing, and transportation of feed, the methane emissions by the ruminants, energy consumption at the feedlots and slaughterhouses, the amount of antibiotics and pesticides used, and the amount of waste generated, then it's easy to understand why the environmental impact of meat production is so significant. But it's not just meat, right? It's the industrialization of the food system that is the problem. This type of food production that relies on land clearing, monocultures, heavy machinery, processing, packaging, external inputs, herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, have environmental and health consequences, especially if you consider all the additives, food coloring, preservatives, emulsifiers that these foods contain. Given the significant overlap between climate change and cancer control solutions, we recently evaluated the inclusion of climate change in comprehensive cancer control plans. There are currently 65 states, territories, and tribal health organizations that are required to have a comprehensive cancer control program because they receive funding from the CDC as part of the National Comprehensive Cancer Control Program. Of the 65, 2 actually mentioned climate change in their most recent plan. Alaska, which mentioned pollution released from melting glaciers, and Illinois, which mentioned supporting EPA rules that reduce exposure to air pollution and address climate change. However, more than half of the plans included cancer control strategies that are also climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, and some included several different mentions. For example, a few of the states mentioned disaster preparedness, which was very few, but unsurprisingly, Louisiana, which was impacted by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, was one of them. Some plans mention climate adaptation strategies that are relevant for cancer preventive behaviors. California and West Virginia mention providing space for walking clubs when the weather is inappropriate for exercising outdoors. And Utah mentioned planting trees to increase shade availability for outdoor physical activity during hot days. But trees do more than just provide shade. Trees' cooling capacity is not only due to shade, but also transpiration, which further decreases local temperatures. Think about the difference in temperature when you stand under a tree compared to when you stand under a man-made concrete shade structure. Trees also allow the creation or improvement of stormwater systems because the soil around the trees helps with water infiltration, which can then help reduce flood risk. And trees also clean the air with carbon capture. So planting trees was also mentioned by several plans, which included strategies to reduce exposure to pollution, which is one of the most obvious connections between climate change and cancer. Even more plans mention strategies to incentivize active transportation, which increases physical activity and reduces our reliance on single vehicle transportation, which we already discussed today. And finally, the most common was mentions of strategies related to reducing our reliance on the industrialized food system. These included improving access to community gardens and farmers markets, reducing consumption of ultra-processed foods, institutional agreements with local food producers, and including traditional foods in dietary guidelines. And understanding the health co-benefits of climate mitigation and adaptation strategies is important because in the end, we all have three options when it comes to climate change: mitigation, adaptation, or suffering. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be necessary and the less suffering there will be. And our research can contribute to each one of these buckets. We can evaluate how environmentally responsible policies and practices impact cancer risk and outcomes, for example, or how to improve emergency preparedness and response efforts. Of course, nobody wants to contribute to suffering, but suffering is already happening, and we can document current health consequences of climate change in a manner that increases awareness and informs solutions. And the action items here go beyond research and include our individual actions, as well as the policies and practices of our own institutions. Here is a list of some options that are available to institutions that can reduce our environmental impact and also contribute to better health outcomes. And if you're looking at this list and thinking about your school or your place of employment, and then you're thinking, this lady is crazy. There is no way my institution, my school, or my place of employment will ever do any of these things. Then let me ask you something. Are you allowed to smoke on campus? How do you think that happened? How do you think that started? If you're attending this talk, you most certainly have the power to make a difference. So recognize where your points of influence are. Use your leverage. Move the world. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, Leticia. That was amazing. I learned so much. Incredible overview. I have a few questions, and I'm sure the audience has a few questions too. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat. My first question is, it seems like you do a lot of geographic visualization in your research, a lot of choropleth maps. For example, do you have any suggestions or best practices with respect to geographic visualizations, packages, or programming languages, etc.?
Yes, so we do. I think that a lot of this connection between climate change and health is localized, right? We already say, think global, act local, or that your zip code is more important than your genetic code when it comes to your health. So a lot of this really is GIS based.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we use a lot of R,
Mhm.
and depending on the project, ArcGIS.
Yeah.
But of course, R is free software that can be used. And I would definitely recommend, if possible, there's a lot of options of free classes and tutorials online. edX is one of my favorite platforms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it is a very tricky area of research. You can get to the exact wrong answer if you're not considering some of the limitations of different ways that geographic data is collected and processed. So one of the examples is with the Flint crisis with lead in water. Initially, they had evaluated the data using zip code. And zip code, if you talk to any geographer, it's their least favorite unit to work with because zip code is for delivering mail. It tells you very little about the environment or the characteristics of an area. So the very first analysis that was done in Flint used zip code and found no association. And then another researcher compared the data now with the zip code of where the people lived, but what was their water source? And of course, that's when the whole when it grabbed media attention and it was recognized as a crisis. So it's really important to be confident in the unit or how granular your geographic unit of analysis is. And there's plenty of software, and R is one of our favorites again because it's free and easily accessible, but I'll definitely recommend taking a course or reaching out to somebody who has been doing this type of analysis for a while. because it's one of those that can get you at the exact wrong answer some of the time. And because a lot of health data is protected by HIPAA,
Mhm.
we are many times very limited in how granular we can get with geographic data. So that's something else to keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure. That's a so if a zip code level is not granular, at what level do you get deeper levels, like at the block level, or what do you
Block level is great. Census tract is much better than zip code already. You won't all, the actual address is the best one.
before? Okay.
But it's you won't always be able to get that. And also sometimes, I'm in the health services research group. We're looking at the type of exposure or health outcome that the lever or that the modifiable factor is modifiable either at the county level or at the state level. So we do some studies with Medicaid expansion or county policies for wildfire prevention. And then even though we might be able to get more granular data, we move it to less granular data because that's the level where the decision making happens. So it really depends on your research question which one is the best unit of analysis.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think our audience would really appreciate that. Well, I have another question. From a statistics standpoint, do you do a lot of, for example, spatial regressions? What statistical analysis have you found useful in your research?
Yes, we do a lot of spatial regressions, and we do a lot of other types of methods, and it really is project specific. So,
Mhm.
for example, for the hurricanes paper I mentioned, we propensity score matched the patients. So all patients were treated at the same facility. Some of them, when a hurricane happened, and some of them had to be very similar to that patient, treated at that same facility, but at a time when no disasters happened. So that was one of the ways that we operationalized the data that we had. On the wildfire study that I mentioned, we used a completely different method because the patient was discharged from the hospital and went home. And that's when we used NASA satellite data to identify a wildfire nearby. But then we got into these tricky methods component that for us to be able to evaluate the association between proximity to wildfire and long-term survival, which is
Yeah.
really what we want to see in these patients that just received treatment, we want to see them survive a really long time. We had to factor into our analysis this concept called immortal time bias.
Mhm.
So every patient who was discharged from the hospital went home had some time between the day when they arrived home and the day when the wildfire happened. And they had guaranteed survival during that time, right?
Mhm.
So the patients who go home and unfortunately end up dying the day after or that same week are not alive long enough. And it sounds awful, but for the exposure to happen. So
Mhm.
we had to find methods to correct for this immortal time bias,
Mhm.
right? Knowing that everybody who was exposed was definitely alive between the date when they got home and the day when the wildfire happened. And
Mhm.
for that project, we used a completely different method that's called inverse probability weight to
Mhm.
correct for this immortal time bias. So it really is dependent on the project. And speaking of edX, the platform, one of my favorite classes that I ever taken on how to approach a research question and identify all these different types of biases and even the best possible unit of analysis is on edX, and it's called causal inference
Mhm.
by Miguel Hernan. So I can definitely share the link with you
For
or
sure.
something like that.
Yeah.
It was one of the most helpful
Yeah.
courses I've ever taken. And
Yeah.
I definitely recommend if people are interested in looking into this type of research.
For sure. I think if you could post that in chat, I think people would really like that.
Yeah.
Um, I really liked your comment. I'm just checking to see if there are a few questions on the chat. I really liked your comment about deriving insights from lived experiences. That's really profound. Do you have any suggestions for our audience how they might pursue this line of inquiry in their own research? Any best practices or overcoming obstacles? And any thoughts from that?
Yeah. So I think that in many ways, the scientific community has been obsessed with this type of dry or sanitized, come up with a hypothesis, right? And this assumption that we can understand came from Newton's insight of the apple falling on his head, and then him realizing that the same gravity here works the exact same with the sun and the earth and the moon. It's like, oh my gosh, what an amazing scientific discovery, right? And so there is this concept in the scientific field that everything has to be isolated from their context, and the same experiment that I do here in Florida works the same in California and in Brazil and in Afghanistan. All has to be the same. But there's this other concept that's closer to Einstein's insight, that the context in which things happen matter a lot, right? That gravity and time are associated in different ways. And so that the context in which our experiences happen can define the outcomes of your scientific project, right? And so that's one of the first realizations, I think, for understanding why is it that having a diverse group or number of people collaborating that see a problem in a different way, that have different lived experiences, because our lived experiences shape how we see a problem and how we see the solutions. I met somebody once who said that all research is me search, right? So we see the problem, we see the question, we see the data in completely different ways, depending on our lived experiences. So these are some of the things I sometimes try to bring up when there's this pushback about, oh, you know, it needs to be taken out of context. This needs to be sanitized, and to try to explain, well, the context actually matters a lot here. And I think that the scientific field as a whole is moving more towards that direction. And so explaining, I think that first of all, you need to do your homework, right? You have this project idea, hurricanes and cancer. Is your sample size big enough? Do you have a data source that you can access? Do you have the methods figured out? Do your homework first, have it all match what the scientific field expects a research project to look like. And then if there's still pushback, then you can mention, or at least my favorite strategy, how is this project that you came up with your lived experiences, which if you just say, because I think so, or because this is my lived experience, doesn't go very far most of the time. But if you say that the outcome of this project aligns with the mission of the institution that you're trying to highlight the importance of this research, and I think most of the academic institutions, health institutions that we interact with have a very clear mission, and it's much easier for people to connect and understand the importance of this type of research that maybe nobody else in the room thought of because they had different lived experiences than you do.
Yeah, I think that's very thoughtful, very interesting. I think, and to some extent, you're include when you say lived experiences, you're including correlations, local variables that affect you that you might not include in sort of a generalized setting. So it definitely, you know, and there are variables that are weighted more highly for you. And so to include them in the analysis, you know, sort of makes sense. And in the broader category, we having more variables that people tend to weight differently are makes sense for the analysis that make richer an analysis as well. There's actually a question from David who says, what was the starting point to make relationships between climatic factors and cancer?
I think Harvey, really, I had worked with cancer research my entire career, right? And working the response to Harvey really was the light bulb moment because, like I said, I was working at the state health department at the time, and I was in Austin, not in Houston, because that's the capital and that's where all the government buildings are. And I was on the data side of things. And so we were collecting all the data of what was happening on the ground and then helping make the decisions of where to dispatch different teams and what kind of emergency response needed to be done. So when Harvey hit, what was really striking is that the days before it hit, everybody was calm. We've done this before, we got this, we have our plan, no worries, right? We did everything, checked all the boxes, and then Harvey hit. And Harvey hit and behaved completely different than anything that had hit Houston before. And that was because of climate change, because the warmer air holds more water vapor thing that I said at the beginning. And so with Harvey, it wasn't the wind, it was the rain. The amount of flooding was unprecedented. And then all of the emergency preparedness and all of our plans, it all just, I'm sure that there is an American expression about going down the drain with the water or something.
Yeah.
None of it worked, right? And so that's when I had this light bulb moment that climate change is going to pose threats that we are not prepared for, and that people who are the most vulnerable, cancer patients and other type of vulnerabilities, medical vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities, are going to suffer the most. And we really, without data, without understanding these impacts, then we can't identify solutions, we can't implement solutions. And that's really when I had this moment that I needed to work with climate change. These disruptions in access to care, the way that it impacted the hospitals was the very first one. But because I was already working for the state and doing a lot of the cancer cluster investigations in this area, the second connection between how the exact same activity, this reliance on fossil fuels, is both generating the greenhouse gases and then also exposing the population to carcinogens was another very obvious one. And it all happened August 24th, 2017, when Harvey hit. And I will never forget that day.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting. I have another question. Many times immigrants and racialized people are told that our anecdotes are not data or that it is less quality data. How can we better research and how can better research and data storytelling incorporate partnerships and acknowledge the experience of immigrants and racialized people?
Of course, yeah, that is a daily struggle, right? So you mentioned something, lived experience, or even something that you read from another scholar from an underrepresented group, and the immediate response was, who said that? Did you say that? Where's the citation? Or where is
Yeah.
the data? Or right, prove it. None of that comes when people talk about their lived experiences who are from the overrepresented demographic groups. But people who look like me get that sentence every day. And so this is a part of what and again, I'm not an expert in this. This is not scientific. I'm just telling you my very own personal experience is to be in touch with your lived experiences, think about them, and then shape them or present them in a way that's recognizable to the people who hold the power and hold the privilege to come up with whatever hypothesis without being questioned, right? And so this is what I mean by do your homework. If you have a question, it's another thing that a lot of times we need to work twice as hard to get half as far, but it's true. Some people can just say a hypothesis and everybody's like, oh, what a great idea. And we can say a hypothesis and they're like, no. So do your homework. You have an idea. Before you even present it, try to see, is there data on this? Has somebody else done something similar? What kind of data and methods did they use? Do a power analysis first. Have it all figured out. And really, we have to increase our participation or propose these things, or at least this is my strategy, within the structures we are working, right? It gets very overwhelming very quickly, especially with a topic like climate change, if you're trying to fix the structure and propose a research. So for some of the things I kind of pick my battles, this is the structure of the scientific community. So if I speak that language and I did my research and I make it very hard for people to say this is not feasible, and I explain the importance of the research topic as it relates to the mission of the institution I'm talking to, then it's much easier that even though this came from your lived experiences, if you mention this is coming from your lived experiences, speaking the language of the scientific community, and it's much harder for people to push back. But I'm not sure if that's great advice. That's just what has worked for me sometimes.
I think that's really fantastic. It's very practical advice. That's for sure. And I would say that being able to connect with people and what they want to accomplish, I think it definitely helps. Let's make progress here. We come from different directions, different angles, but let's find a way to meet in the middle and we can all agree on certain basic things and find a way, put aside whatever differences we have, and just, look at the numbers. We're all statisticians here, and we all, we can all agree on certain things. Let's start with what we can all agree on and make progress. And I think
Exactly.
that sort of mentality, very open mentality, and very communicative, collaborative, and respectful mentality. I think that really, in my experience, it has helped to make progress, and regardless of where people are coming from. So I think that even within WIDS, we try to foster a community where people are having respectful dialogue, and being able to share their models, share their statistical approaches. And if you notice, our chat is often, it's very active, and people come in from various, from all over the world, and they share, their perspectives, their approaches, very substantial way, in a substantive way, but they can also make progress on whatever questions, technical, social, whatever questions they are. And so we do foster that approach, we foster that community within WIDS. And I think that, it's really great for us to hear your approach and your strategies, and we'll definitely incorporate that, encourage our community to include some of your ideas and thoughts. And
Yeah, I think that I just wanted to mention to you, this is so important, having a community where you
yeah,
can relax, where you can make mistakes, right? Where
yeah,
you have an idea and you need to run it by people, right? And the
yeah,
people who you're working for sometimes, are immediately going to disagree with you. So you need to run it by somebody else first, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
try to have this idea be a little bit more structured or a little bit more advanced before you present it when the stakes are super high. So a community like WID sounds like the perfect, right? Does
yeah,
anybody know a data source for this? Does anybody see any pitfalls with this method? It is
yeah,
so amazing. And also, as you make these connections early on in your career, your peers raise with you.
yeah,
And so the stakes are going to be higher later on. But once you have this connection and you know each other and you trust each other and you're comfortable being yourself and showing a somewhat vulnerable idea here first, then you also get practice for explaining your ideas and all of the boxes that you need to check before you present it when the stakes are higher. So this is such an amazing resource for all of the ones involved. And again, I'm so happy to be here today.
No, that's we are a community, and you're part of our community. So we become better as you have more outstanding speakers like yourself, present in our workshop. It becomes stronger. And the reason WIDS was started is because we wanted to provide these resources to women. And these are, before, in California, in Silicon Valley, where we started, women, it was harder for women to do these technical things like hackathons. They weren't necessarily invited. It was overwhelming. It was we wanted to, and our founders felt that we could provide these resources, and and make it a very welcoming environment. And now we have participants from all over the world, women and men. We're open to everybody, and we provide these resources, and also a community where people share. Whatever you've learned, you build models in all our competitions. I mean, I learned so much about packages I never heard about. Wow, okay. So I think that it's just a communal learning, and not one person can know everything there is to
Right.
know about everything out there. So the ocean of knowledge is so huge, so we're all covering different parts of it and learning together. I think that's and that having that sort of openness and humility, and
Right.
learning together. I think that and these are difficult problems. As
Mhm.
data scientists, this is unprecedented, in the history, to have so much data. And so being able to access all of the statistical methods, but also being able to communicate clearly, respectfully, and, fantastic storytelling, all
Mhm.
of that, it's our responsibility to do that. And we try to foster that. So I think we learned so much from you and your perspectives and your wise sort of experience and strategy. So really, really grateful for all your insights. And I want to see if there are any more questions. I think that's it. I think we are done. So I think we are ready to conclude, and we're Thank you, Leticia, for an outstanding presentation. And we look forward to welcoming you again to our community. And, anything that you have to share, please definitely share with our community. This concludes our upskill workshop. We will share our recording and slides next week. And please join us for the second WIDS Datathon Challenge, which is still open through June 1st. During this challenge, we're looking at how climate patterns impact access to healthcare and utilizing Gilead's oncology dataset. And also, please let us know what you thought of today's workshop by filling out a short attendee survey. We'll post a link in the chat. Also, if you're interested in giving a WIDS workshop on a topic that you are passionate about, either technical or professional skill building, we invite you to apply to become a WIDS workshop instructor by filling out a brief speaker application, link in the chat as well. And so thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at another WIDS Upskill workshop. Thank you all very much.